So we record these webinars so that if you miss some detail or if you have a colleague who would benefit from it, they're available on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium YouTube page. And I will go ahead and share my screen. So I have the pleasure of kicking us off today, and I'm going to start. I know many of you are experts on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, but there's always a few folks for whom it's a new idea, and this might be your first webinar with us. So welcome. It's great to have you. The Southwest Fire Science Consortium is part of the Joint Fire Science Program, which has been around for a long time now, since 1999. And it funds literally the majority of wildland fire research at this point. And it's kicked off after an internal review, kicked off the series of fire science knowledge exchanges, of which the Southwest is one. And there may be folks from other regions. We're glad to have you today. But you should also check out your local region. So we've sort of divided up the country to make sure everybody is served by some knowledge exchange honed into their geography and their ecosystem. Today, we'll really be focusing on Arizona and New Mexico. The Southwest Fire Science Consortium also covers a little bit of Utah and some of Texas, although we didn't have any big fires in either of those areas this year. Our goal is to be inclusive, to be an impartial broker of science, and really have the collaborative connections that allow innovations to move both from managers to researchers and from researchers to managers. Sometimes it's questions, sometimes it's innovations, but we really need that flow back and forth. And I say managers and scientists, but really it includes all of us, whether you think of yourself as a policymaker or a planner or the public. And here's maybe a better list than off the top of my head. It's all of us. That's the audience. It tends to be, when we say the public, it tends to be the informed public. So we'll, on this webinar, and many will use terms and details that are a little honed in on fire science, but not too hard to grasp for those of us like myself who grew up in silviculture or another discipline. I'd urge everybody to check in on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium webpage. There's some good new stuff up there, and we'll have new webinar opportunities coming up. I can't remember what's scheduled. Rachel Bean has really been leading the charge on webinars lately and has a great series. So you should look for those. In addition to the website, we have a quarterly e-newsletter. So if you're not getting that, make sure to get on the website and sign up for that. We have smaller workshops. Next year, we'll be planning a large workshop in Santa Fe in partnership with the Association for Fire Ecology. We have working papers, and I can't resist hyping a recent one on managed wildfire that I helped with. Be interested in opinions, feedback on it, but it really tries to summarize the existing research around this tool of managing natural ignitions. So that's on the website. We have virtual products, things like story maps, virtual field trips. We've learned after surviving COVID, we realized that was a good alternative. And we do have a proposal system. So if you have good ideas that you want to see happen, get in touch. And I'll actually go to our next slide. Molly McCormick is our coordinator. She is awesome and is on the ball. And so if you have an idea, she's the perfect person to work with to make connections, or perhaps rent some vans to get people out in the woods, or find some space that we can all meet together. It's great to have these online webinars. It's easy. It's just a short time during the day, but it's so much nicer when we can get together in person. We actually had a recent trip to the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire scar, and I certainly learned a lot, some of which I'll sort of touch on today. And with that, I'll end the introduction, and I will switch to the overview. So I have sort of joint role today, both as facilitator and presenting on our review of the 2022 fire season. And let me just get this up and rolling. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes about last year. And then we're very fortunate to have Chuck Maxwell to talk about the outlook from the meteorological perspective, fuels perspective for this coming fire season that is, I guess, already started, although maybe slower than some years. So let me get this going. Feel free to use the chat while we're rolling here. So I've just put a message in there, put in questions or comments. I may try to grab a few questions on 2022 before we transition to 2023, but we'll also have time for questions at the end because maybe there's sort of a connection between the 2 years that you want to make. I want to recognize I'm speaking today, but Lara Wood-Miller did the GIS, the spatial analysis for what I'll be talking about for last year. And Carlos Saiz really did the lion's share of drafting the report. And the final report is not quite done. The draft is done. It's in review. So it'll be out soon. And apologies. It always takes longer than we think it's going to. So, but it will come out soon. It is now the 10th in a long series of looking back at the fire season that we've experienced. And so on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium website, you can look back to 2013 or whatever year. There are a number of fires now that we're seeing reburn. So fires from 2016 are relevant for 2022. And so hopefully being able to turn back to past years is useful. Setting the stage for our fire season. Obviously, we started the year in drought. It's always looking at this drought monitor map. It's always a little bit, I have to remind myself that the best condition here is abnormally dry. And the red is not just severe drought, but extreme drought. And the exceptional drought is, we don't have any in the Southwest back in January, but it's on the map. And so we're already in just an elevated level of drought that I think it's easy to forget just how extreme it is. And I will point out that one of the areas in extreme drought back in January was northern New Mexico. And obviously with the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak, that's a kind of recurring issue through this conversation. One of the things we like to do is try to put the fire year in a little bit of perspective. So this graph just looks at the number of acres burned by wildfire in the Southwest and the prescribed fire. It's become more difficult to get prescribed fire numbers. Those used to be nicely rolled in with some of the other wildfire numbers. Now we have to kind of dig around to find overview numbers, although I think next year we'll be back to better numbers for that. So I would take that prescribed fire number with a grain of salt, but it does, overall, it gives you this perspective that 2022 is similar to 2002, 2005, 2020, sort of similar levels of 1 million acres or more in the Southwest. Prescribed fire less than some years, but not as limited as, say, when we had COVID in 2020. So that's the overarching, and now we'll zoom into a few more details. Chuck could probably give a much better explanation of the energy release component, but I've learned to really hone in on this as a useful tool for understanding what's going on with the fire season. My layman's understanding of the energy release component is the amount of energy that a flaming front, a modeled flaming front, could release given the fuel moistures and fuel availability. So essentially, again, in my layman's terms, how bad could a fire be if it gets started? And really notably here, one of the things that really struck me is that in April, for 2022, that's the blue line, we crossed the max historical line. So the red line was the maximum from the 2003 to 2021 period. We crossed over that, set a new record essentially for the period of April. And that's when a number of these fires got started. So that's in addition to the drought, well, and probably related to the drought, obviously, the ability to release energy from a flaming front was incredible, really just in a lot of ways off the charts. And then we see it precipitously drop. This is for the northern New Mexico area. So it's the Southwest is divided up into a number of different zones, but all the zones look somewhat similar here. As the monsoons came in, you see a precipitous drop back below the sort of average. So, you could think of it as fuels getting more moist, receiving that rain, and being below sort of the average amount of energy being able to be released. So that's, we can refer back to this, but the main story here is very high levels in the early spring and then dropping off to below normal. Just a quick note on the data we used. We use publicly available data, the Canopy Mortality from the Ravage data, remotely sensed information. So it is remotely sensed. That brings with it a big caveat that it's not field verified, but not based on wall-to-wall field data. The same is true for the soil burn severity. It's a different remote sensing model to try to get at the soil rather than the canopy, but it's essentially the same remote sensing platform. We also use data from the Southwest Coordination Center. So this provides us information, for example, for that first graph about number of total acres in the Southwest. It provides some information about the ignition, so whether it's human, undetermined, or lightning. It, in some years, has provided us some information about the dominant management strategy used on the fire. If you want to get into those details, go back to that managed wildfire paper I mentioned at the beginning. Well, in this case, most of the fires we're talking about, almost all of them are human caused. And so the dominant management strategy was full suppression. The fires that we're looking at, here they are on the Southwest. All the little X's are all the ignitions. I believe it was everything over 100 acres. So you can see there are a lot of fires in the Southwest. We know we live in a fire-adapted ecosystem, but we're focusing on 10 of the largest fires, all over 10,000 acres. Tunnel pipeline in northern Arizona, Contreras, San Rafael in southern Arizona. And then in New Mexico, our largest fire on record, Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon. Our second largest fire on record, the Black Fire. And then the Bear Trap, Cerro Pelado, Cooks Peak, and Mitchell. I'm going to step through each of those based on when they occurred during the season, and then provide some summary statistics. And then we'll transition to looking ahead, thinking, okay, we survived 2022. What are we looking forward to? So a lot of the story from 2022 is dominated, unfortunately, by Calf Canyon, Hermit's Peak. There's a lot to say about this fire. I won't say nearly half of it. I think, as we all know, it was started by planned ignitions, pile burn, as well as a prescribed burn merged together. There's been voluminous review of those incidents. I don't think we'll go into those today, but it's important to acknowledge. Really what I'm focused on is how it affected the vegetation and the soil, but it's hard to think about Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon without thinking about the post-fire effects and the impact on communities downstream from this kind of high severity area. Looking at this map, this is the soil burn severity map. There are huge patches of very high severity soil burns. And so, for example, in this southern area, right up above communities and very high severity. When we look, if we try to take a dispassionate view and look at the overall burn perimeter, there is lots of area with low or moderate soil burn severity areas. With a fire so large at 340,000 acres, even small, relatively small areas or small patches, this is a very small map. So these are huge patches when you walk out there in the field. So Brian Bird is asking about aerial ignitions. I'm afraid, Brian, I can't speak to that. That's not a piece I know. The operations and where aerial ignitions occurred. I would say that as you track back, we look back through the 209 reports, which is sort of the daily reporting on fire management, in this case, fire suppression, and the extreme winds that they dealt with basically through the whole length of the fire. I don't think you would need to look for any other reason than the extreme drought, the extremely dry fuels, and the really brutal wind speeds. But maybe aerial ignitions played into it as well. I know that there was a huge effort to protect communities and a lot of use of fire to manage the wildfire. So the overall area might be larger, but I think there's also a question about whether some of the areas, I know, for example, along the highway, and I'm forgetting the route number, some of those areas were backburns to suppress the fire, but resulted in relatively low soil burn severity. So there's a complex story, certainly not one that we can unpack today, but there's more and more coming out. There's some great story maps from the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute that tell a little bit more detail of the story of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon. The other thing that I wanted to highlight based on the way we handle these reviews is the fact that Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, even though it burned 340,000 acres, only burned a tiny bit that had burned in the last 10 years. So there's a little area that burned in the commissary fire in 2015, but otherwise we don't have records of recent fires in the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon area. And we'll contrast that a little bit with the Black Fire and some other fires we touch on briefly. So you can see I've got a little locator map that will follow along, as well as the time along the bottom. So trying to look at these chronologically. When we get to the next fire that ignited later in April, still before the monsoons came, so still in that period when the ERCs were above the historic maximums, the Cook's Peak fire ignited a little bit. You can sort of see in the locator map a little bit to the northeast of Hermit's Peak. Much smaller fire, as you can tell from the bars at the bottom, less than 100,000 acres. And similarly, very little overlap with past fires, a little bit where it burned the White's Peak fire perimeter again. In general, much less high severity when we look at the soil burn severity map. Large areas of low unburned severity, which is likely to have positive ecological effects when we consider that this is burning through fire-adapted ecosystems. As we move on, the next fire to ignite was the Tunnel Fire in Arizona. And this is kind of conflated with a pipeline fire that we'll touch on, which ignited towards the end of the season, but it's useful to have them on the same map here. Again, relatively low soil burn severity, very few patches of high severity, but this had dramatic effects on the population, lots of evacuations, and unfortunately, lots of homes lost. So it was a fast-moving fire, fair amount of grass or sort of shrubs that it burned through, but relatively small in size, although outsized impact because of its location in the WUI. The next fire to ignite was a Cerro Pelado, and in New Mexico, in the Jemez Mountains, you can sort of see from the locator map, this burned a huge, well, most of the Cerro Pelado burned in the footprint of the Las Conchas fire. So when we look at the canopy mortality, most of that area had fairly low canopy mortality, but it's in the context of having recently been burned at relatively high severities from Las Conchas. So how do we understand that reburn, and what does our canopy mortality tell us as we're thinking about that? So that's a bit of a complex story. And we can see that there were some high severity patches where on the eastern side, or sorry, the western side of Cerro Pelado where it ignited. But it did burn in a context of treatment and past fires. So the Cajete fire burned in 2017 in an area that had been treated. The Blanco Benito RX and the Thompson Ridge fire provided, I think, some comfort to managers as they thought about the potential spread. Similarly, the Pino on the south side was used for at least some portions of the control lines. So a very different context, but still large areas of high severity. And we're seeing now, I just got an alert, I think it was yesterday, on flooding from the Cerro Pelado. So continue to have impacts on people and ecosystems. The next fire that ignited was in eastern New Mexico in the grasslands. We don't have canopy or soil burn severity maps, so we're looking at the vegetation condition class. This is a metric of how departed the ecosystem was from historic conditions. In this case, it wasn't very departed because it's burning mainly through grasslands. There's some pockets of juniper and some oak pockets. But in general, it was grasslands, not very different from what we would expect historically. Moved very quickly, unlikely to have a lot of, we don't have the maps, but making some assumptions, which is maybe the wrong thing to do, unlikely to have had too negative impacts in terms of soil burn severity. Then we have a little break in ignitions until May. When the bear trap in sort of west central New Mexico started. And this burned in the context of the 2016 North Fire that was essentially the eastern boundary for the bear trap fire, and it reburned portions of the Red Canyon fire from 2015. So this again emphasizes this issue that as more and more fires are burning in the Southwest and we're tracking them, we're seeing these reburns that maybe we didn't see in the 90s. Bear trap had a fair mix of severities, and patches of high severity, smaller fire. So these are relatively small patches compared, well, at least compared to Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon. And maybe that sort of mix of severities that we might expect, although probably a little higher canopy mortality than we prefer. The next fire, which was sort of mid-May, was in the southern Arizona grasslands, shrublands, burned some chaparral. Didn't burn across recent fires, but had, based on mapping, had some more patches that were departed from historic conditions. So maybe burning in ways that are less beneficial. Then we had the Black Fire ignite in the Gila. This is another huge fire, over 300,000 acres. And a very different context than the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire. As probably everybody on this call knows, Gila has active fire program, both prescribed fire, management of natural ignitions, as well as things like the Silver Fire that was a full suppression fire, which had negative consequences. But the 2022 Black Fire burned through a whole range of both prescribed and natural fires. And so one of the things we're seeing is very different soil burn severity picture, much less of those sort of big patches of high severity that we saw in Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon that are really hard to look at. Some areas, for example, the 17 Round Fire or the 19 South Fire, as it reburned in the Black Fire, had low severity. Some areas in the Silver Fire did have high severity, this reburn 10 years later, or almost 10 years later. And then I would also point out that some of the prescribed fires and fires on the north edge, as well as on the western edge, provided control lines or ways to manage the Black Fire. Then the monsoons came. So then the picture changed a little bit. We got well, some of us got a little respite from fire, although the Black and the Hermit's Peak continued to burn during this period. But it wasn't until later in June when we had the Contreras fire in southern Arizona. Again, we don't have the burn severity maps for Contreras, but it does give us a picture of of the departure from historic conditions, generally moderately departed. And again, this was more in a shrub chaparral kind of environment. The last fire, and I realize I'm going quickly, but we want to leave time for the outlook for the coming year. So the last fire that I'll touch on is the Pipeline Fire, burned right near the tunnel fire, similarly caused a lot of evacuations. It burned with a little higher soil burn severity based on partly on the vegetation it burned through. But really, even though they burned at opposite ends of the fire season, they end up kind of creating this joint fire perimeter. So at the risk of moving too quickly, I want to jump into some summary statistics for the season, just to provide you a little way of trying to remember what happened last year. One of the things we see when we look at the types of vegetation that burned, it's dominated by the big fires. So we had two 300,000 acre plus fires, and those are the Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon in green, and the Black Fire in orange. So that's sort of what's driving our stats here. We can see both of those burn large acreages of ponderosa pine. And so that was the dominant vegetation type, more than 350,000 acres of ponderosa pine just in these largest fires. So obviously there were additional fires. These large fires, 10 largest fires, made up about 87% of the acreage that burned in 2022. So not too much more to add to these graphs if we could, but there would be a little bit more. We also saw large areas of mixed conifer, pinon, juniper, and unlike some years, some spruce fir that burned. And then we can see that things like chaparral, conifer oak, grassland, many of these other fires were in those vegetation types. And because they were comparatively smaller, they don't kind of register as much on these graphs. We were talking a little bit about vegetation condition class. They've split these a little bit more finely. So if you're seeing more bars than you're used to, that's because we now look at low departure in two levels of moderate departure. And there are 2 levels of high, although in what we saw last year, only one was mapped. And so what we see here is where the Black fire, again, kind of Black and Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon are dominating things, burn through low to moderate departure, except for these areas of high departure. I think there's some mapping issues going on, because when we look at Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon, we're not seeing high departure. But for those of us who've been to that area on the eastern side of the Sangres, there were a lot of areas that, in my view, had I been given a ranking, I would have marked them as highly departed, given the density of things like ponderosa pine and the poor condition. We also can look at summaries of the canopy mortality. We have fewer fires to include here because only 6 of the fires had this data available. But what we can see here is where Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon is really dominating. When we look at where did we lose canopy, a forest canopy, or I guess any vegetative canopy in 2022, well, it was the Calf Canyon, Hermit's Peak. The black fire generally burned with much less impact on the canopy. And obviously, we can't neglect the fact that the pipeline and tunnel are in here and have an impact. But just in terms of on an area basis, they don't show up as well. The soil burn severity looks a little bit different, a little less maybe optimistic, with more of the black fire being in those moderate or high categories. Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon continues to just dominate those categories. And then the last slide I have here, and then we'll change gears. So get ready, Chuck, is looking just at suppression costs and size. So the size of the circle is the cost, and then the acres burned here is on the Y, and we also have the suppression cost on the X-axis here. So one of the things to look at here is we have 2 very large fires with large acreages, but the black fire had, when we look on a per acre basis, just had less, had fewer dollars per acre to manage it. And that's not a value judgment. It's just that in our society, we do many things on a per dollar basis. And so it is useful to start to think about how these fires break down in that context. And I think that's due partly to the fact that we didn't have as many populations and many people at risk with the black fire. We can also see that the Cerro Pelado was a sort of higher cost per acre fire, but the rest of the fires are sort of clumped down just because of the size in that part of the graph. So all that data, more details will be available soon in the publication. So with that, I'm going to stop my rapid fire presentation here. Thank you very much for being here for that. And we are going to change gears. I will stop my share. Yes. And Chuck, you should be able to start sharing. And while you're doing that, I will take the time to really express my gratitude to Chuck Maxwell with the Predictive Services, USDA Forest Service. Chuck has been, I've been working here 17 years or so, and he's added incredible knowledge and value, certainly to my understanding of meteorological issues, the getting a view of the fire season outlook. So it's really a pleasure to turn it over to Chuck, and do feel free to put some questions. We'll hopefully have a little time at the end. And with that, I will be quiet, and Chuck, the floor is yours.
Good deal. Thank you, Zander, and thank you everybody for having me. Good afternoon. So as you said, Chuck Maxwell, I've been working here at the Coordination Center for over 20 years. Used to work at the National Weather Service before that, so I've been in New Mexico forecasting fire weather for over 25 years. Yeah, Zander and I have quite a long history. One thing before we get going, what we forecast here, very important. We don't just forecast kind of all fires. We kind of pointed towards the kind of fires Zander just spoke about, maybe the top 20. We're looking at real large fire activity, the kind that causes to move metal and people within the national coordination system. That's just going to be important as we go forward because there's going to be other fire activity and stuff going on that may not pertain. But we're basically looking at fires on the order of hundreds, if not thousands of acres, the kind that cause us to use national resources. That'll be important because it's a little different than other stuff. So I'll shut my video off and proceed. This works as planned. Okay, so the first slide I want to start with is something that struck a good chord here 2 weeks ago. So you might remember about a couple weeks ago in the news, the fires were raging up in Alberta, Canada, with temperatures in the low 90s. And it was approaching Mother's Day here, and people were talking about a massive rain event and below normal temperatures and what's going on, world on fire. We look at these kind of large scale hemispheric patterns to figure out what we're doing, because these are the large scale pattern which drive the kind of fire we're looking for. So this is the kind of stuff I'm going to be showing you, like temperature and precipitation anomalies. But the big picture is we're looking to figure out where the large scale patterns driving large scale fire activity across the Western United States, and more specifically in the Southwest. So just to be clear that we are looking at the whole Western Hemisphere. We will narrow it down for you. And as different than many years, as Zander alluded to, we're already halfway through. It should be our climatological fire season, yet we have not had much fire. So I'm going to start with kind of an update on the current conditions and fire activity, and then we'll talk about looking ahead because it is such a different year. It's just noteworthy to show this stuff. So starting with the rainfall and the percent normal rainfall across the Southwest over the past week and 2 weeks, excessive, fit with that pattern. Incredible amounts of rain across New Mexico, eastern New Mexico especially. But the bottom line is you do not see rainfall of this nature hardly any at all this time of year. And so to see rain of that nature, precipitation for a couple of weeks straight with anomalies approaching 600% normal is extraordinary. I have never seen this in my career here yet. We'll see what the future portends, but this is absolutely opposite of last year if there was such a thing. Along with the precipitation at the temperatures, and this is really critical here, have been much below normal in terms of daytime maximums. This is part of what drives fire during the day, and when your daytime temperatures are in your peak season, we're pushing, 3 to 6 to even 10 degrees below normal. That just really works against fire working the way it's supposed to this time of year, keeps the burning period shorter, and has really worked against us having large, prolonged, aggressive fires so far. Back to these ZRC charts, Zander had shown some earlier ones, and he's dead on. It's showing basically, it's kind of like cumulative dryness and all the dry fuels out there, how hot things could burn. Key factor does not include live fuels at all. It does not include grass or the live fuel moisture in the forest, but it looks at the greater dead fuels complex. It's a useful metric. As Zander showed from last year, I'm showing this year in the dark blue line. Southwest 1 is Northwest Arizona. That Southwest 10 is the Sangre de Cristos. 6 South is down near Tucson. And that one in the lower right hand is down near Ruidoso. Bottom line, as Zander said, similar pattern everywhere. We are way below normal in most places for this time of year. A couple places hit historic minimums in late May, which is very unusual. And we're running our seasonal dryness in terms of fuels and its energy release component is about where it should be normally during the 3-month monsoon period that hopefully comes later this summer. So one of the ways I described it is our season ended or wound down rapidly by June 18th last year. We may just be getting going by this year with not a clear picture of what's ahead. So it's absolutely the opposite of what happened. That green line in there for reference is last year's energy release component. So it shows a really good comparison between last year and this year. Night and day, 2 degree. Just wanted to give a quick look, and I'll show the link at the end. This is we have a live fire monitoring map on the SWIC webpage, the Southwest Coordination Center. And what's important here, this is from today. There's not a lot of dots on there that were from yesterday. There's not a lot of the red ones, which are the big fires usually, and there's a lot more prescribed fire going on in the green dots. So we're really seeing about one of the slowest starts of the fire season we've ever seen in terms of suppression. We are seeing aggressive prescribed fire activity, and we're just not seeing large fire activity at all unless we're helping it along. Total acres for the Southwest right now is about 56,000 total burned, all agencies. We had individual fires and divisions on fires last year that exceeded that, as Zander pointed out. So starting off low and slow, getting a lot of good prescribed fire done. I know, for example, they're using some of the burned area last year from the black fire to help keep that past fire in check down there. Excuse me. So everything is kind of coming together to use fire back to back, year to year with different conditions. Just wanted to give a glimpse of what the large fire perspective is. This is more along the lines where we're predicting. Doesn't show it well, but this is way below normal, and it's kind of in the areas we'd expect at lower elevations, south and east. Most of the ones up on the Milligan Rim here are ones we've usually helped along to get to that size. So not so bad at all of a year, way, way different than last year. We'd be showing perimeters and smoke plumes. And just to show that the current trend maintains this cool and moist signal well through the middle of this month. So this is really going to be interesting to see what happens with our monsoon in the rest of the season. So I wanted to lay that out there as kind of the current condition. I already hit some of these. Usually when we give these briefings, we do a whole rundown that includes all these, the drought, the fine fuels, and so forth. We're already about step 3 or 4 down here looking to the monsoon. So I won't hit all these, but I will talk about some of them. The drought, and Zander brought this up, it's key, was substantially mitigated as of this the past rainfall event through late April and May. The drought monitor is showing a lot less of that angry red there, and the drought outlook finally showing drought removal and mitigation across portions of eastern New Mexico. They've gotten 4 to 8 inches of rain out there in the past several weeks. So some good news overall for the Southwest. We managed to get mostly out of long-term drought as of right now. But that causes other issues, including 3-foot tall grass. Leading into this picture. So we get this from remote sensing data from the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Without going into great detail, anything that's greenish color, greenish blue on here is much above normal fine fuel loading in terms of grasses. Some of the dots there just represent some specific standout areas, but I think if you look outside and even this is what Zander said up north with the grass last year, we have a near historic amount of grass and fine fuels out there. Whoops, pardon me. And they're still growing now since we're getting more rain. And what we're really looking for, everybody knows eventually this cures out and will be available to burn. When will that be? Will it be this season? And what will happen when it does? So bottom line is we're going to have a situation in the future, either weeks or months away or next year, where we have an absolutely incredible landscape out there driven by grass fuels, not so much the forested areas, where drought's been somewhat mitigated. I will not talk much about this except to have you look at the little circle in the lower left there. And as it shifts from the blue color to the red, that's if you're people talking about the double, triple dip La Nina and the shift to a strong El Nino. That's what's driving our atmospheric pattern right now. That's all that's really showing. This is meant to be an SME slide, so I won't show it to everybody. This one's kind of pushing it too in terms of communicability. But one thing I do want to point out, if you look at the June, this is the same pattern I showed like on the very first slide. This was predicted by Rich Naden here, who's kind of a climate specialist. He's been assessing these months in advance and predicted this pattern that caused this weather several months ago and allowed us to advise our folks here we would have a below normal May and June and a questionable monsoon, which has worked out. But the bottom line is we look at patterns in the upper atmosphere going forward to try and help us predict what's happening. Anytime you have upper level low pressure in or near the Southwest this time of year, it's a problem. It's atypical. Usually the monsoon's delayed and you're getting rain or strange weather. And that has played out. As part of our predictive process too, again, this is kind of past tense, but it shows what we were forecasting. Did a real good job of latching on to the cooler, more moist conditions kind of in the Southwest. You can see how the moisture wraps up around the low, up across, and pretty much like it looks in the satellite right now. If you look at the satellite picture, there's a big upper level low over the four corners, spinning moisture exactly that way. bottom line is it looks like we've nailed May and June in terms of the moisture and precipitation impacts in here. And the big question is going forward in July and August, will we indeed dry out? How much? How long? Because if it does, and we have lightning here and dry grass, we're going to have a fire situation. Interesting map here. It shows some of the areas I was referring to before, the zones, but it also shows when the monsoon is typically tended to start or onset kind of from east to west. That's the median date when we see our large fire activity really trail off. With this year, with the shift from La Nina towards a strong El Nino, there's lots of correlations we see in the past years, and with the current weather, what we're seeing now is just a lot of uncertainty for this monsoon. I don't think we're going to see those dates work out. We're beginning to be concerned if we actually see a monsoon pattern set up at all, and for how long and when. This will play into the forecast here with some question marks, but that's when things normally wind down. That may be this year when things are starting to wind up. So our forecast, and you'll see that there's some blank areas in there because we need to discuss it. In the short term, it's pretty straightforward. This is the most green that's ever been forecast below normal significant fire potential. It's ever been forecast in the Western United States in June, ever, in the 25-year history of our program. As we move into July, August, and September here, what we do know in the Southwest, there's a couple things we do know. We know we have a heck of a lot of fine fuels out there, historic amount of fine fuels. And those are going to tend to dry during the monsoon or through the fall at some point. That's a given. What we really don't know right now is if this monsoon is going to set up and bring rain as it should, or just a lot of lightning and wind and kind of a mess. So we should have probably highlighted some above average areas here of fire potential. We simply don't know where those would be right now. So we're really in kind of a strange situation where we need this current pattern to kind of cease. We need spring to end finally, hopefully before July 4th, before we can even begin to assess when and where, how things are going to be bad potentially later in July, August, September. So we're kind of taking things week by week here, just talking to people to, it's raining here, get your rest, whatever, and maybe prepare to fight fire later in the summer when we're normally not doing it. Unfortunately, that's about the best we can do right now for what we're looking at. This is our Southwest Coordination website. I just want to put it up there where you can go and access all these products and some of the information I showed you on there. I'll shun the presentation over to Zander so we can ship it out if you want. I think that's all I had though. Ours is such a very general perspective. Just looking at very, very large fires and so forth, that this is about where we're at right now and about the best we can do.
That's great, Chuck.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, thank you for giving that overlook. And it does seem like a lot of uncertainty. While we're waiting for other folks to chime in or ask questions, you can put them in the chat window or you can unmute. I'm gonna take my privilege as facilitator here and ask, and maybe it's not an answerable question, but I'll throw it out anyway. How much of this is sort of just year to year variability? Do you sense some climate change signal in here that it's something unusual that we haven't seen before?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, as a scientist in this field, I look at climate change as messing up those large scale hemispheric patterns. So I guess in answer to your question, I don't look at it in terms of temperatures rising or sea surface necessarily. I look at it in terms of, are we seeing weather patterns that match the season?
Yeah.
When we're seeing something like this is completely out of phase with the season, and which is unpredictable and it hasn't been seen before, that's, yes, there is a climate change signal or change of some kind. To me, it's really the Earth trying to move heat around, move warmer air north, colder air south. It's doing very strange things and is probably responsible for this unusual pattern. I don't think, Zander, to your point, I don't think we've ever seen a triple or double dip strong La Nina like we've seen, for example, flip to a strong El Nino like this. I think that's historic in the past 100 years. So we are seeing changes in the atmosphere, large scale like this over massive periods and areas that have not been seen in this century.
Yeah, and it just I mean, I know you said this, but it just highlights for managers the difficulty of how do you plan in that environment. Yeah, other folks want to unmute or add questions to the chat, things you've seen on the ground. And we can go back to the 2022 season as well. If you're not careful, I recognize some names on here, so I may call folks out. One more minute here, but if there are no additional questions, no reason to keep folks on. I think yeah, maybe it makes sense, Chuck, to think about a little bit of a follow-up. I mean, maybe I know that your standard cycle is really providing managers information, what we think of as before the season, but there may be a need, and perhaps the Southwest Fire Science Consortium can help to get information out as we see things changing in August.
Yeah, I that's kind of our whole posture here now, is we're trying to figure out what to do next. We've done business so much by climatology and the calendar and just flip that. Yeah, I think you're right. We're kind of on a week-to-week cycle now. And I think it'd be great to get back together again in August. We might be fighting fire, we might be done, or we might be just starting.
Yeah. And Cole does have a question about in the off seasons here in the Southwest, does the Southwest Coordinating Committee review predictions compared to what happened to determine accuracy?
It's a good question. We certainly do, to try and look at it. But again, we're really measuring those large fires too. So that kind of makes it different. A lot of the stats like you've seen on our website are like total fires, total acres. It makes it confusing, bottom line. So we do validate the environmental portions of the predictions and the large fire activity. We don't have the charts to show you, but what we did find is ahead of time, like on 30 to 60 days, we were predicting with above normal areas about 70% of all the large fire activity. So not perfect, not terrible, but at least some skill.
Yeah, better than flipping a coin. Certainly, given the impacts, worth listening to.
Yeah, I want to make another point showing these ERC charts again, is that I mentioned that these only measure dead fuel moisture. So this is in no way covering the amount of grass out there or its condition. So what's really important is these may or may not from here forward be reflective and accurate of what's actually going to happen for our fire season. That's a big concern and issue. This has been so reliable for so long. We're now entering into a paradigm where we're really looking to do aggressive fine fuels and live fuels monitoring and reporting, because we're really going to need that through the summer to get this figured out, and probably for the duration.
Yeah, and certainly there are going to be some areas where those fine fuels are going to carry right over into 2024.
Yes.
So that's getting my wheels turning, making me a little nervous. Well, I'm not seeing other questions come through, so I think trying to make the best use of people's time, we'll wrap up here. But thanks everybody for joining on. I certainly learned a lot. So thank you, Chuck. And we'll look into seeing if we need to do a sort of addendum later on in the season, because there's so much changing that yeah, we may need to update. Thanks everybody, and I'll close off the webinar now, but hope to see you on future events. Thank you.